America is facing a crisis. It's quiet, but deadly. It's in our cities, our suburbs, even our rural towns. It doesn't discriminate. It affects everyone, young and old, rich and poor. This isn't about a war overseas or a political scandal. This is about fentanyl. For too long, the fentanyl crisis has been whispered about in hushed tones. It's been relegated to the shadows, treated as a problem for those people. But the reality is, it affects us all. It's time we stop looking away and start paying attention. We need to understand how this crisis came to be, how it spiraled out of control, and what we can do to stop it. Believe it or not, fentanyl didn't start as a street drug. It has a legitimate medical purpose. Developed in the 1960s, fentanyl was hailed as a breakthrough in pain management. Doctors used it primarily as an anesthetic during surgery. It was particularly effective for patients with severe pain, like those undergoing cancer treatments or recovering from major surgery. Fentanyl works by binding to opioid receptors in the brain. These receptors control pain and emotions. When fentanyl attaches to these receptors, it blocks pain signals and triggers a release of dopamine. Dopamine is a feel-good chemical. It creates a sense of euphoria and well-being. In a controlled medical setting, fentanyl offered patients much-needed relief. It was seen as a wonder drug, a way to alleviate suffering and improve quality of life. Fentanyl was a double-edged sword. Effective for pain relief, but with a high risk of addiction. Even in small doses, it could be habit-forming. Patients develop tolerance, needing higher doses, classified as Schedule II by the DEA. High potential for abuse, but still prescribable. Strict regulations monitor its production and distribution. Despite these regulations, problems began to emerge. Pharmaceutical companies, seeing a lucrative market, began aggressively marketing opioid painkillers, including fentanyl, to doctors and patients. The message was clear. Pain was the enemy, and opioids were the solution. Doctors, facing pressure from both patients and pharmaceutical reps, began overprescribing these potent painkillers. What started as a treatment for severe pain quickly expanded to address more common ailments like back pain and arthritis. This widespread availability of prescription opioids, fueled by aggressive marketing and lax prescribing practices, created a perfect storm. People who might not have otherwise been exposed to opioids were now becoming addicted. The more people used these drugs, the greater the demand became. And as demand increased, so did the potential for misuse and diversion into the illicit drug market. Enter the rise of synthetic opioids. Unlike heroin, which requires cultivating poppy fields, synthetic opioids like fentanyl could be manufactured cheaply and easily in a lab. This made them incredibly profitable for drug traffickers. Sensing a new market opportunity, criminal organizations began lacing heroin with fentanyl or even selling it as heroin outright. The reason was simple. Fentanyl was potent, addictive, and cheaper to produce than heroin. It was a deadly business decision that would have devastating consequences. This shift towards synthetic opioids marked a turning point in the opioid crisis. Fentanyl's potency and low cost flooded the illicit drug market, creating a new wave of addiction and overdose deaths. The crisis was no longer confined to prescription painkillers. It had seeped into the illegal drug trade, making it even more dangerous and unpredictable. The journey of fentanyl from a controlled substance to a street drug is a twisted one. It involves international trafficking networks, lax regulations, and a relentless demand for cheap and potent opioids. One of the key players in this story is China. With its vast chemical industry and lax oversight, China became a major source of fentanyl and its precursors, the chemicals used to make it. Chinese labs, often operating under the radar, began mass-producing fentanyl and shipping it directly to the United States and Mexico. These shipments were often disguised as legitimate goods, making it difficult for law enforcement to intercept them. The internet provided a convenient marketplace for these illicit transactions. Buyers could order fentanyl online and have it delivered discreetly, much like ordering a book or a pair of shoes. While China played a significant role in supplying raw materials, Mexican cartels saw a lucrative opportunity in the fentanyl trade. They established sophisticated production labs and trafficking networks, taking advantage of their infrastructure for moving drugs into the United States. The cartels mixed fentanyl with heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine, creating a deadly cocktail that amplified the potency. This wasn't just about increasing profits, it was about creating a more addictive product, hooking users deeper into addiction. The cartels exploited the porous US-Mexico border, smuggling fentanyl across land, sea, and air. They used hidden compartments in vehicles, underground tunnels, and even drones to move their deadly cargo. Fentanyl's potency made it easy to smuggle in small quantities. A few grams, easily concealed in a backpack or even a pocket, could be worth thousands of dollars on the street. This made it incredibly difficult for law enforcement to detect and intercept shipments. The cartels were always one step ahead, constantly changing their tactics and routes to evade detection. They used encrypted communication channels, recruited corrupt officials, and employed violence and intimidation to protect their operations. It was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, with lives hanging in the balance. The lack of visibility into the supply chain made it difficult to assess the true scale of the problem. By the time authorities realized the extent of fentanyl's infiltration, it was already deeply embedded in the illicit drug market. Fentanyl's presence wasn't limited to the shadows of the black market. It also seeped into counterfeit pills, made to look like legitimate prescription medications. These pills, often laced with lethal doses of fentanyl, were sold online and on the street. This was particularly dangerous because it targeted a wider demographic, including young people. Many users were unaware they were consuming fentanyl, often with tragic consequences. What looked like a harmless painkiller could be a lethal dose of fentanyl. This deception eroded trust in legitimate pharmaceuticals and fueled a public health crisis. This is where the story takes a truly infuriating turn. Because while the cartels were busy flooding the streets with fentanyl, some pharmaceutical companies were playing their own part in this disaster. See, these companies knew just how addictive opioids were. They knew people were getting hooked. Yet, they aggressively pushed these drugs anyway. Why? Profits. They saw dollar signs in every prescription pad, in every aching back, in every person seeking relief. They poured millions into marketing campaigns, making sure doctors saw opioids as the answer to every pain-related problem. They hired charming sales reps to wine and dine doctors, showering them with free samples and biased information. They funded studies that downplayed the risks of addiction and exaggerated the benefits of opioids for chronic pain. It was a full-blown opioid gold rush, and these companies were more than happy to cash in, consequences be damned. They created a culture of overprescription, where doctors felt pressured to prescribe opioids even when safer alternatives existed. They lobbied politicians to weaken regulations and make it harder to hold them accountable for their actions. And what did we get? A nation hooked on pills. Millions of Americans became dependent on opioids, their lives spiraling into addiction. This wasn't just a failure of individual willpower, it was a systemic failure fueled by corporate greed. These companies prioritized profit over people, and the results were devastating. But it wasn't just the pharmaceutical companies. Regulatory agencies, tasked with protecting public health, also failed to act with the urgency the situation demanded. The Food and Drug Administration, FDA, responsible for approving new medications, faced criticism for its role in the opioid crisis. Some argued that the FDA had been too quick to approve new opioid-based painkillers without fully understanding their long-term risks. Others pointed to the agency's close ties to the pharmaceutical industry, suggesting a conflict of interest that may have influenced its decision-making. The Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, tasked with enforcing drug laws and monitoring prescription drug distribution, also faced scrutiny. Critics argued that the DEA had been slow to crack down on suspicious prescribing practices and had failed to adequately track the flow of prescription opioids, allowing them to be diverted to the black market. These regulatory failures, combined with aggressive marketing tactics and lax prescribing practices, created a perfect storm that fueled the opioid epidemic and paved the way for fentanyl's deadly rise. It was a system rife with failure, where profit was prioritized over public health, and the consequences were dire. So far, we've talked about fentanyl in abstract terms: numbers, statistics, and corporate greed. But behind those cold, hard facts are real people. People like Jessica, who thought she was taking a harmless painkiller. She had no idea it was laced with fentanyl. One pill, one fatal mistake. Her story is tragically common. Then there's Michael, a veteran struggling with chronic pain. He became reliant on prescription opioids, but turned to the streets when his prescription ran out. Michael overdosed alone in his apartment. These aren't just isolated incidents, they're part of a devastating pattern. Every day, families are torn apart by fentanyl overdoses. Parents bury their children. Spouses lose their partners. Children grow up without parents. Behind every statistic is a story of lost potential, shattered dreams, and unimaginable grief. Communities are ravaged by this crisis. First responders are overwhelmed with overdose calls, often witnessing the same heartbreaking scenes unfold day after day. Hospitals are stretched thin, treating overdose patients while struggling to keep up with the demand for addiction treatment services. The ripple effects of this crisis are far-reaching, impacting every facet of our society. Take, for instance, the story of Sarah. A single mother from Ohio, Sarah's life was turned upside down when her son, Ethan, overdosed on fentanyl-laced heroin. Ethan was a star athlete, a good student, and a loving son. But like so many others, he fell victim to the allure of opioids, getting hooked on painkillers after a sports injury. His addiction spiraled out of control, leading him down a dark path that ended in tragedy. Sarah found her son unconscious in their home. She desperately tried to revive him, but it was too late. Ethan was gone. He was 22 years old. Now, Sarah dedicates her life to raising awareness about the dangers of fentanyl, sharing Ethan's story in the hopes of preventing other families from experiencing the same unimaginable pain. The statistics surrounding the fentanyl crisis are staggering. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, over 107,000 Americans died from drug overdoses in 2021, with fentanyl being the primary driver of these deaths. That's more than the number of people who died in car accidents and gun violence combined. These numbers are shocking, but they don't tell the whole story. They can't fully capture the human toll of this crisis, the immeasurable pain and suffering inflicted on individuals, families, and communities. To truly understand the fentanyl crisis, we need to look beyond the statistics and see the faces of those affected. We need to listen to their stories, share their pain, and honor their memories by fighting for change. Faced with this mounting crisis, the question becomes, what are we doing about it? The answer, unfortunately, is complicated. There's no single solution, no magic wand to wave away this epidemic. What we have is a patchwork of responses, some promising, some inadequate, some downright harmful. Law enforcement agencies are ramping up efforts to crack down on drug trafficking, targeting cartels and disrupting supply chains. But as we've seen, shutting down one supplier often just creates a vacuum, quickly filled by another. It's a bit like playing whack-a-mole with a highly profitable, highly dangerous substance. On a more hopeful note, there's a growing movement towards harm reduction. This approach recognizes that addiction is a health issue, not a moral failing. It focuses on reducing the negative consequences of drug use, rather than punishing those who are struggling. Needle exchange programs, for example, provide clean needles to intravenous drug users, reducing the spread of HIV and hepatitis C. Naloxone distribution programs equip first responders and even everyday citizens with this life-saving medication, which can reverse an opioid overdose. These programs are literally saving lives, giving people a second chance at recovery. But let's be clear, harm reduction alone won't solve this crisis. We need to address the root causes of addiction, the systemic issues that make people vulnerable to substance use disorders in the first place. That means holding those in power accountable. We need to hold pharmaceutical companies responsible for their role in creating this crisis, for prioritizing profit over people's lives. We need to demand stricter regulations, tougher penalties for deceptive marketing practices, and investments in addiction treatment programs. And most importantly, we need to change the way we talk about addiction. We need to move away from judgment and stigma and towards empathy and understanding. Addiction can happen to anyone. It doesn't discriminate based on age, race, or socioeconomic status. It's time we treat it as a health crisis, not a moral failing. We need to invest in treatment programs, make them more accessible and affordable. We need to support those in recovery, provide them with the resources and support they need to rebuild their lives. This isn't just a problem for those people, it's a problem for all of us. We've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the origins of fentanyl, its deadly potency, and its impact on our streets. The devastating impact on individuals, families, and communities. The role of pharmaceutical companies and the failures of our healthcare system. This crisis has been unfolding for years. We're still losing over 100,000 lives every year. That's 100,000 too many. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, but we can't afford to become numb. Each number represents a life cut short. Ignoring this crisis won't make it go away. The longer we wait, the higher the price, and that price is measured in human lives. So, where do we go from here? What can we as individuals do to stem this crisis? First, we need to acknowledge the problem. It affects us all. Educate ourselves about fentanyl and overdose signs. Demand better from our officials and hold pharmaceutical companies accountable. Challenge the stigma, offer support. This isn't hopeless. We can tackle this together. Choose a path of compassion and hope. The time for action is now.